Welcome back to this week's Parent Parsha series, Parshat Toldot. I really wanted to try to think about a way to actually incorporate an idea that I heard this week in actually my Daf Yomi shir by Rabbi Rosner. I heard it earlier this week, and I was like, I need to figure out how to incorporate this into my Parsha video this week. And I was actually talking it out with my mother-in-law, Dr. Bendheim, this morning, and she really helped me kind of put all the pieces together. I was like, I know this somehow connects to the Parsha, and I was trying to merge all of it in my head. So as we know, and if you don't know, you'll know in about a minute, we are coming up on Rosh Chodesh on Friday. And Rosh Chodesh is the celebration of the new moon. And if you're following the Daf Yomi cycle, so you also know that the last couple of pages, there's been a lot of discussion on how the new moon gets declared, how the new month that gets declared, and the complexities around the month's declaration and the witnesses that come forward, and also the implications for the holidays and whether the declaration of the month is in and of itself a mitzvah or how it relates to the setting up of the holidays, and thinking about 1 day versus 2 days and the possibility for even a potential mistake and what that looks like and what that means. And an idea that Rabbi Rosner always talks about, which is not necessarily related to anything, but I think an important thing to think about, is that Shabbos is something that Hashem set for us. Hashem created it. No matter what happens, Shabbos comes, whether we light candles, whether we declare it as a day of holiness. Shabbos was established as a time period by Hashem. He imbued the day with holiness. By contrast to Moadim, to holidays, which are very much related to the new month establishment, is something that we have the power, that Hashem has given us the power to put on to the calendar and to create, and to in that way is almost like become partners with Hashem in this process. And Rabbi Rosner on a few dafs ago earlier this week was talking about the idea about why is it that women were given this holiday in some capacity. There's a discussion about the fact that Rosh Chodesh really should be a day of no malacha, and why it's not a day of not malacha, but that some women specifically are noheg, that there was a minhag, a custom for women to actually not do malacha. And some people have like abridged this in some capacity. Some people in some way make the day special, and specifically as it relates to women. And he talks about the fact and raises the question, like, what was special about women and Rosh Chodesh? And he talks about the fact that Rosh Chodesh in and of itself, and particularly the moled almost, is like something that you can barely see, but you know it's going to become something. It's actually the epitome of optimism. You haven't seen it come into fruition yet, but you know that it's there, and that women hold optimism, specifically around the issue of the egel, where they didn't give their jewelry to the Egel HaZahav because they had optimism, they had belief, a deep sense of emunah that Moshe was coming back. And the same situation we saw in Mitzrayim, the same midah, the same characteristic that women had by Mitzrayim, that they went back out to the fields, and even though their husbands didn't want to be with them, so that they wouldn't have any more children because they thought this was like horrific, and how could they bring more children into this horrible situation of slavery. And women really dug their heels in and said, this is not going to be the end of us. And it is our optimism that leads to our being to a strong sense of determination, that we will be able to come out the other side better than when we are today. And I was thinking about that in relation to like this week's Parsha specifically, these two components, this idea of optimism, of looking at the world, seeing something, even if it's hard, even if it doesn't necessarily look like it's going to be something that is positive, and then actually being able to ground ourselves in it in a sense of determination, a determination to make the situation better. And I was thinking about like how this would relate specifically to this week's Parsha and the personalities in this week's Parsha, and if Rashi was going to kind of like give us any benefit to this idea, like would I be able to find it in the words of Rashi? Because I was very committed to maintaining Rashi and parenting and Parsha for the book of Bereshit. And I was thinking about the fact that Yitzchak, though Yitzchak as a prototype character tends to have this idea of passivity, which we don't necessarily think about in relation necessarily to optimism and determination. One of the pieces that I was thinking about is the fact that he does have a piece of him that feels optimistic to me in his ability to be reparative. In other words, when he leaves the Akedah, the Torah tells us that we find Yitzchak later that he's coming from Be'er L'Chai, which we know was the place that Yishmael went to. And there's a lot written about this idea that Yitzchak goes back to reunite with Yishmael. And we know later that Yishmael and Yitzchak together bury Abraham, right? That even though there has been so much pain, even though there has been so much sadness and so much rejection, that Yitzchak views himself as a person who has the capacity to look towards the future and to make the unfathomable possible, right? They never thought that Yishmael would come back together. And this idea potentially that Yitzchak goes and brings Hagar back to Abraham as a potential second wife, this whole idea of Keturah and who she was, etc., all centers around this narrative around Yitzchak being in Be'er L'Chai and then coming back together. And I think we see this again when it comes to Yitzchak, particularly around the story of Rivka not being able to actually get pregnant. We know that it's one of the few scenarios in amongst the Avos and Imahos, I guess, in contradistinction, where we have Abraham on one hand and Yaakov on the other hand, who very much, Abraham almost like we don't even hear so much about the pain that he experiences vis-a-vis Sarah not being able to have a child. It kind of gets wrapped up into the story of Hagar and how it gets played out around Yishmael and Sarah's potential jealousy around Hagar and Yishmael, but we don't necessarily hear Abraham connecting with Sarah's pain. If anything, it feels like he has a hard time really digging in around it. And Yaakov, for sure, we know that his approach to Rachel, when she's describing the pain of not being able to have a child, feels very cold and almost disconnected. Like this idea that shouldn't he be enough for her, really kind of undermining maybe this deep sense of connection that he needs to own part of her sadness and figure out a way to work together as a team. And the Yitzchak Rivka narrative stands in contradistinction to that, because we're always struck, at least I'm always struck by this notion of v'ater. Yeah, Yitzchak prays with Rivka. If anything, it's that he prays for Rivka. And Rashi actually points out, here we go. Rashi actually points out the fact that one of the ideas about tefillah we learn from this moment, which is that the power of praying for somebody else and somebody else praying for you, right? He prays for Rivka, Rivka prays for him, and together, them both praying for the other person, right? In some ways, it's like looking at the other person with a certain sense of belief that it's going to end well for them, right? It's even if you can't think about it for yourself, it's sometimes so much easier to believe the good about somebody else than it is to integrate the good about ourselves. And interestingly enough, oftentimes we see that with our own children. We look at our children and we think to ourselves, why can't they just see the beauty of themselves? Why is it so hard for them? We sometimes remark that we feel like our children are just so hard on themselves. They're their hardest critic. And we kind of want to imbue the beauty and the optimism and the amazingness that we feel about them. We want them to feel it. And sometimes they can't feel it. And I think one of the beautiful things that parents have the capacity to do is to actually be those eyes for their children, to look at opportunities to say, no, you don't feel this right now. And we touched upon this a little bit last week with the idea of small brachot every day, but really trying to think about the ways in which we can help them also ground themselves in a sense of optimism, but also a sense of determination, right? That our optimism leads to determination. We think that things can change, and we are determined to help them make those changes, even if it requires a little bit of problem solving, even if it requires thinking about the other more than ourselves, and really thinking about the ways in which those concepts frame our family and our daily interactions with our children, I think is quite powerful. I think we see this again later in the story with Yitzchak, right? Again, Yitzchak gets painted as this personality who's just very passive, right? Rivka's acting upon him. She has a vision of how this is going to go, and she basically decides that Yitzchak needs to be fooled in order to give Yaakov the main bracha. And when Yitzchak realizes this treachery, right? This like real devious behavior that has occurred to him, and that he gave the bracha that was meant for Esav, he gives it to Yaakov. Like, you see, he's devastated. And I think one of the pieces that I don't know if I love about this story, but I find so powerful about this story is that I'm imagining sometimes this scene we're so used to the story. Rabbi Angel actually mentioned it this week in relation to actually a totally different story, that we're so used to the stories, we know them so well, that sometimes we don't pay attention to the details in the pshat of the psukim that help us dig in around the intensity of the emotions of the feeling. And so I'm imagining this scene where Yitzchak is feeling so great about this interaction that he just had. He gave this amazing, beautiful bracha to his son, who he thinks is Esav, and Yaakov goes kind of running out the back of the tent, and then here comes Esau, prepared to give his father this wonderful meal, anticipating this wonderful bracha that he's about to get, only to realize with deep horror that they both must share in this moment about what has just occurred, and the pain and the sadness, and trying to imagine what that was like for Yitzchak to know that his son was in such deep pain and feeling like his life was over, right? It's the opposite of optimism, that he's like basically feeling like everything about him was stolen from him, and that the father was the one who caused that, and really trying to sit with his son in that moment of pain. And so one of the things that I think is so powerful about Yitzchak is we think about the passivity, but in reality, maybe it's actually that Yitzchak once again dug into a moment where he was recognizing that this is so sad, this is so painful, I need to just be with you. I can't act similar to the Akedah, right, for himself. Like, I can't act and change the scenario that just happened, but I can try to make it a little bit better. I can try to fix this. And he thinks about how he can fix it, and he gives him another bracha, right? The recognition that there is more than one blessing. He is determined to somehow fix this because he has an optimistic view that this doesn't have to be the end of the narrative, that there is a capacity for change. And I think that that's such an important piece. And I think about this a little bit, just going back to this idea of like, what does the keshet represent, right? We always think about this idea that Yaakov was the person who sat in the tent learning, and Esav was this like evil hunter with this bow and arrow. And the idea of actually keshet and bow, which again is brought up in Rashi. Rashi helps us understand what does it mean that he was a man of the field, and makes reference to this idea of bow and arrow. And I think about this idea of what does it mean to have a bow and an arrow? So there's a lot of like Kabbalah around bows and arrows. There's specific Kabbalah around this idea of bows in terms of rainbows and keshet and promises of peace and tranquility, and the idea of like shooting an arrow. So there is something about this idea of focusing on something and pointing towards something. So it has a lot of negative connotations in terms of we're thinking about it in terms of each side and using it as a tool for hunting, but it's also has positive connotations when it's not necessarily used in the framework of hunting and killing, but also in terms of focusing. There is different ways that the arrows can be pointing to indicate peace. There's also the idea that like a focused arrow that you're shooting is a point of determination. Again, coming back to this idea of optimism, determination, all roads leading back to kind of this idea of like the importance of being determined about certain aspects, right? Esav was determined to be very focused, I guess, for good and for bad on his hunting, but he used it in such a wonderful means, used it in such a wonderful characteristic. And, Yitzchak was very determined, I guess, in many ways to try to make peace in his own family. We see it with Yishmael. We see it again with Esav and Yaakov. Like, I wonder if he really thought maybe if he gave him a second bracha, that would be the ability to create a certain amount of peacefulness, right? That the arrow and bow and arrow that was Esav's didn't have to be a sign of violence, but it could be a sign of peace and hopefulness. And so I'm thinking really about these multiple ideas that keep coming back together, and thinking about ways that we can help our children develop a certain amount of grit, a certain amount of determination, that if they want something, they can go after it, and that they can feel like they have the capacity to go after it, and framing it in a way that imbues them with our own optimism about who they are, what they have the capacity to be, and holding that for them when they're not necessarily feeling as optimistic about themselves, even if it feels sometimes hard for us, and being able to hold both aspects of it, that ability to hold the aspect where I know you don't feel so good about this, but you've really studied so hard, and I know you're going to do so well, and well as a reflection of the fact that you worked very hard. That is in and of itself very well. And rewarding determination. I saw that you really, not necessarily, again, that result effort, but thinking about the way we talk about our children's work as a Yeah, of course, there's results. We don't want to get like totally off the beaten path and say like the end result never matters. But there's something about the tahalif, the journey, that is so much more important. The amount of grit, the amount of determination that it took, the fortitude, and actually working hard in our parenting with ourselves and with our children to be rewarding the tahalif. I'm so impressed that you came home from school and you gave yourself a break, and then you sat down and you really focused and you did the work, or you made a schedule for yourself, and you stuck with it. And that must have been so hard, and you must be exhausted. And I'm really proud that you like dug in, or you called a friend who hurt your feelings. That must have been hard, hard work. We're thinking about the process. We're thinking about the fact that not every process has to be positive, not everyone has to be negative. We want to just embrace and really reflect the process as part of their journey, as part of their development. And the key components of these character traits of optimism, of determination, which I think really come into focus around Rosh Chodesh as well. When we think about the optimism that that this month will be the month of Geulah, that this month will be something that is new, that even though we can barely see that moon, we know that it's going to start to shine its light on all of us, and the determination of all the people who at that time who saw the new moon and would go to all the efforts to reach the Beit Hamikdash, to reach the Sanhedrin, to be part of the process of establishing a new month, to be able to be part of a process of engaging in the process of creating the calendar, and thinking about the fact that in Judaism and in Torah and in parenting, we want to really be reinforcing the process, the journey, and the determination that leads us along the journey. Okay, so there's so many fun things to do. I'm really loving the challah piece. I think I might have to do bow and arrow challah. There's also tent cookies for Yaakov and learning, and thinking about the fact that, this is just like an off the cuff, not necessarily related, but the fact that we want to be able to try to make space for different kids in our home. And I think that Rivka is such a complicated character. She disappears from the scene at the end of the story with Esav and Yaakov, and there's something that it is a complicated story. I think Rivka has a harder time connecting to Esav. She feels very connected to Yaakov, and it's an interesting piece about how you understand the fighting in her womb in terms of maybe her own battling herself, how she connects with her own children in different ways. But Yitzchak really connects. It feels he connects with both of his children, or maybe they both struggle with connecting with each child that feels further from their tree, shall we say. Something to think about. And so thinking about the ways in which we are determined to try to find opportunities and avenues to connect with the children that feel a little bit further from our tree. So there's a little parenting plug in there also. I love the bottom. It's just like I found it and it came to me because it has a bow. So thinking about bows and arrows and thinking about all the different ways that bows can be symbolic of peace and love. And then it has the glasses, which represent like a certain sense of how we look at the world, and how we look at the experience and how we look at the journey. And it's not just the end, right? You look through glasses. It's not just about what you see at the end. It's everything you see in between. So I think it really sums everything up. I want to just wish everybody a Chodesh Tov. I hope it's a beautiful month. I hope it's an inspiring month. I hope it is a strengthening month. And I hope it's a great Shabbos.